It was late October, and the rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. I had agreed to house-sit for my cousin, James, who lived deep in the Appalachian foothills. His house was nestled near the edge of a sprawling national forest, where the only noises you could hear at night were the rustle of trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. James had warned me that the area was known for its folklore, stories about strange creatures lurking in the woods. He laughed it off, saying, "People around here just like to scare each other." Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I drove up the winding dirt road to his property. The rain pounded against my windshield, and my headlights barely cut through the foggy darkness. When I arrived, I quickly settled in and tried to ignore the eerie atmosphere. The house was an old log cabin, cozy but creaky, with large windows that faced the dense woods. I brewed a cup of tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat by the fireplace, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. By midnight, I decided to call it a night. I was jolted awake at 3 a.m. by a sound. It wasn't the rain or wind, it was something else. A scraping noise, faint but persistent, coming from the side of the house. I froze, my heart racing. It didn't sound like an animal, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I grabbed the flashlight James had left for me and hesitantly made my way to the window. Peering out, I could barely make out the silhouette of the forest through the rain. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the house, but as I turned to head back to bed, I heard it again, closer this time. My stomach twisted. The sound had moved to the front porch. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I tiptoed toward the front door. The porch light was out, leaving only the faint glow of my flashlight as I slowly opened the door. Rain splattered onto the porch, and the wind howled. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it, a set of muddy footprints leading from the driveway to the porch. Barefoot. Human-like, but off. The toes were elongated, and the heel was unnaturally narrow. The flashlight flickered, and my breath caught in my throat. I quickly backed inside and locked the door. I grabbed James's old hunting rifle from the closet and sat in the living room, trying to calm my nerves. It was just a prank, I told myself. Someone messing with the city girl who didn't belong out here. But then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. But as I sat frozen, the knock grew louder, more insistent. I mustered the courage to call out, "Who's there?" No response. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I aimed the rifle at the door, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the power went out. The entire cabin plunged into darkness, and the sound of rain and wind filled the silence. I could hear something moving outside, circling the house. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I shone the flashlight toward the window, but the rain obscured everything beyond a few feet. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and melodic, calling my name. "Katie." My blood ran cold. It was James's voice, but it wasn't right. It sounded distorted, like a bad recording played underwater. "Katie, come outside. I need your help." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. "You're not James," I shouted. The voice laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. The laughter grew louder, echoing all around the house. And then, it stopped. The silence was worse than the laughter. I could hear my own panicked breathing, the pounding rain, and nothing else. I didn't dare move, clutching the rifle like a lifeline. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, it felt like an eternity. Finally, the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, and the rain subsided to a gentle drizzle. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The muddy footprints were gone, washed away by the rain, but something else caught my eye, a small object placed neatly on the porch railing. It was a necklace I hadn't seen in years, one James and I had found in the woods as kids. I knew I had left it in my jewelry box back home, miles away. My hand shook as I locked the door behind me and called James. He answered groggily, and when I told him what happened, his voice turned deadly serious. "Katie, get out of there. Now." "What? Why?" He hesitated before saying, "That necklace, it wasn't yours to keep. And if it found you, it won't stop." I didn't ask what he meant. I grabbed my keys and bolted, leaving everything behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and swore I saw something standing at the edge of the woods. Tall, thin, and impossibly still. I haven't been back to James's cabin since. And I never will. The rain started again as I sped down the winding dirt road, every turn of the wheel feeling like I was pulling further from something I didn't want to understand. James's words replayed in my mind, "It wasn't yours to keep." What did he mean by that? And why hadn't he ever mentioned the necklace before? I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the trees leaning in as if they were watching me. I was so focused on the mirror that I nearly missed the curve ahead. The car skidded slightly on the slick road, and I had to fight to regain control. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over to the shoulder and let out a shaky breath. I was safe now. At least, that's what I told myself. But then I noticed it. The necklace. It was sitting on the passenger seat, glinting faintly in the dim light of the car. I was sure I'd left it on the porch. My stomach churned as I picked it up, the metal cool and damp against my skin. The intricate design of the pendant, something I hadn't paid much attention to as a kid, now seemed sinister, sharp, jagged edges that looked more like claws than a pattern. I couldn't just toss it out. Some irrational part of me feared that if I got rid of it, whatever was connected to it would only get angrier. So, I shoved it into the glove compartment and slammed it shut, as though locking it away might keep it from reaching me. I didn't stop until I reached home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the rain had stopped, leaving the world quiet and still. My little house in the suburbs felt like a fortress compared to the isolation of James's cabin. I locked the doors behind me, drew the curtains, and double-checked every window. The necklace stayed in the glove compartment. I didn't want it in the house. That night, I fell asleep with all the lights on. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was the rain starting again, but as I sat up, I realized it was coming from the living room window. Tap, 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 soft but deliberate. My heart pounded as I crept toward the noise, clutching my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. I peered through the curtain, expecting to see. I don't know what. A raccoon, maybe. But the porch was empty. The tapping stopped. Then it started again, this time at the back door. I ran to the kitchen, adrenaline coursing through me. The back door had a small window at the top, but it was too high for me to see through without standing on something. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. I climbed onto a chair to look through the window, and what I saw made me nearly drop the knife. A figure stood just beyond the door, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow. It wasn't human, that much was clear. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. And it was holding the necklace. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How did it get here? How did it know where I lived? The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I bolted to my bedroom, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My phone shook in my hands as I dialed James's number. He answered on the first ring. "It's here," I whispered, my voice trembling. There was a long pause before he spoke. "You have to return it." "Return it? To where?" "The woods," he said, his tone grim. "It belongs there. And if you don't take it back, it'll never stop." The thought of going back to the cabin made my stomach turn, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my keys and the necklace from the glove compartment, refusing to look at it for too long. It felt heavier now, almost as if it were alive. The drive back to the cabin was a blur. The rain had started again, and the dark road seemed more treacherous than ever. My headlights barely cut through the fog, and I had to fight the urge to check the rearview mirror constantly. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a wave of dread so intense it nearly made me turn around. But I knew I couldn't leave without doing what James had said. The forest was darker than I remembered, the rain muffling every sound except my own footsteps. I clutched the necklace tightly, my fingers numb from the cold. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I made my way toward the tree line where I had first found the footprints. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that I had to return the necklace to wherever it had come from. As I stepped deeper into the woods, the whispers started. They were faint at first, just like before, but they grew louder with every step. They weren't words, not ones I could understand, but they carried a tone of anger, of accusation. I reached a small clearing, the ground covered in wet leaves and mud. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I stood there, clutching the necklace, unsure of what to do next. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes locked onto me. It was the same creature I had seen at the cabin, but now, in the dim light of the clearing, I could see its full form. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I held out the necklace, my hands shaking. "Take it," I whispered. "I'm giving it back." The creature tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, slowly, it reached out with one spindly arm. Its fingers were impossibly long, tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. It plucked the necklace from my hand with surprising gentleness, holding it up to the faint light. For a moment, I thought it was over. The creature turned and disappeared into the shadows, and the air seemed to lighten. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all around me. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, but when I did, I didn't stop. I jumped into the car and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The whispers followed me, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and the woods. By the time I reached the highway, they were gone. I never told James what happened that night. I couldn't bring myself to relive it. But every now and then, when it rains, I hear faint tapping at my windows. And I wonder if it ever truly let me go. It was supposed to be an ordinary drive home. The rain had been relentless all day, drumming against the windows of my office and turning the streets of Portland into rivers. By the time I left work, it was already dark, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I wasn't looking forward to the hour-long commute, but I wanted to get home, put on some dry clothes, and curl up with a hot cup of tea. The first part of the drive was uneventful, though the rain made visibility a challenge. The streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt, creating a hazy glow that made everything feel slightly surreal. I turned onto the back roads that cut through the forest, a shortcut I'd taken hundreds of times before. It was quieter than the main highways, and on a good day, it shaved 15 minutes off my drive. That night, though, the back roads felt different. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching across the road like skeletal arms. The rain blurred the edges of everything, and my headlights barely cut through the mist. Still, I pressed on, keeping my hands tight on the wheel and my eyes fixed on the road. About halfway through the forest, I spotted something in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A woman. She was standing at the edge of the road, her face obscured by a dark hood, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Instinctively, I slowed down, rolling down my window slightly. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. She didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, her head tilted slightly as though she was listening. I felt a pang of unease but convinced myself she must be a stranded hiker or someone whose car had broken down. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and got out, grabbing my umbrella from the back seat. The rain was colder than I expected, and the wind made it hard to keep the umbrella steady. I approached her cautiously, my shoes squelching in the mud. "Do you need help?" I asked again. This time, she turned to face me. Her hood slipped back slightly, revealing pale skin and sunken eyes that seemed far too dark. She didn't say a word, just stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "I can give you a ride," I offered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are you headed?" She pointed down the road, her arm moving in a slow, deliberate arc. I glanced in the direction she was pointing, but there was nothing there, just more trees and rain. "All right," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's get you out of the rain." She didn't move at first, but then, without a word, she stepped toward the car. I held the umbrella over her as best I could, noting how she moved, slowly, almost mechanically, as though she were unfamiliar with the act of walking. We got back to the car, and I opened the passenger door for her. She slid in without a sound, her wet clothes dripping onto the seat. I hesitated for a moment before getting in and starting the engine. The car felt colder with her inside. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to make sense of her. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, but there was something about her expression that seemed older, worn, tired, like she'd seen things no one should see. "So, where are you going?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed again, this time at the windshield. "Straight," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, pulling back onto the road. The rain seemed to grow heavier, the sound of it pounding against the roof almost deafening. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the forest outside seemed to close in around us. Minutes passed in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. I stole another glance at her, noting how she sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. Her nails were chipped, and her fingers were pale, almost translucent in the dim light of the dashboard. "Do you live out here?" I asked, hoping to draw her into conversation. She turned to look at me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "Not anymore," she said softly. A chill ran down my spine. I forced a nervous laugh. "Well, it's not the best night to be out walking." She didn't respond, her gaze shifting back to the road. The further we drove, the stranger the forest seemed. The trees became twisted, their branches gnarled and blackened, as though they'd been burned. The rain, too, felt different, heavier, almost metallic, with a faint, acrid smell that I couldn't place. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Up ahead, the road curved sharply, disappearing into the shadows. As I rounded the bend, my headlights caught something in the middle of the road, a figure, standing perfectly still. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The woman beside me didn't react, her expression unreadable. I squinted through the rain, trying to make out what I was seeing. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. He was tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed too angular, too sharp. His head was tilted to the side, much like the woman's had been when I first saw her. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. "What the hell?" I muttered, gripping the steering wheel. The woman beside me leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Keep driving," she said, her voice low and urgent. I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas, swerving around the figure and speeding down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him turn, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though his joints bent in ways they shouldn't. The woman sat back in her seat, her expression calm once more. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said. "For him?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Or for you?" She didn't answer. The rain continued to pour, the forest growing darker with every mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading straight into something I didn't understand, something I might not escape. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it seemed to intensify, hammering against the car as though the sky itself was trying to drown us. The woman beside me remained silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. I wanted to ask her more questions, demand answers, really, but the words felt stuck in my throat. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the strange figure from the road following us. But the forest was empty, save for the rain and the shifting shadows cast by my headlights. Still, the air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, as though the presence of the woman alone was enough to crowd out any sense of safety. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to me, her gaze unnervingly steady. "Not much further." Her answer did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. "I don't know if you've noticed," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "but there's not exactly much out here. Just trees and rain." "There's something," she said simply, turning her attention back to the road. The trees seemed to grow closer together as we continued, their branches interlocking overhead like a web. The headlights barely pierced the darkness now, the rain creating a shimmering veil that distorted everything in front of me. I thought about turning back, but the idea of stopping, of trying to turn around in the narrow space, felt like asking for trouble. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of light through the trees, small, faint, and wavering, like the glow of a lantern. It appeared on the right side of the road, bobbing slightly as though someone were carrying it. "Did you see that?" I asked, gripping the wheel tightly. The woman nodded. "It's calling." "Calling for what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed ahead, her movement slow and deliberate. "Keep going." I hesitated but did as she said. The light appeared again, this time on the left side of the road, closer than before. It wasn't just a lantern, I realized. There was a figure holding it, though I could only make out the vaguest outline, a tall, thin shape shrouded in shadows. I tried to focus on the road, but the light kept appearing, moving from one side to the other, always closer. My pulse quickened as a second light appeared, then a third, until the forest was alive with flickering lanterns, each held by a figure just out of reach of the headlights. "They're watching," the woman said softly, almost to herself. "Who's watching?" I asked, my voice rising. "What are they?" "Keep driving," she said again, her tone sharp. The lights began to converge, moving toward the road. I pressed down on the gas, the tires kicking up water as the car surged forward. The figures didn't step into the path, but they seemed to line the edges, their glowing lanterns illuminating faces that weren't entirely human, pale and elongated, their features sharp and angular, like masks carved from bone. I couldn't stop myself from staring, and the car swerved slightly. The woman reached over, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Eyes on the road," she snapped. "If you stop, they'll take you." "Take me where?" I shouted, panic lacing my voice. She didn't answer. The forest thinned suddenly, giving way to a clearing. In the center stood a weathered building, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of time. It looked like an old chapel, forgotten and left to rot. The woman leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said. I slowed the car, my hands trembling on the wheel. "This is what? Where you let me out?" Her words hit me like a slap. "What do you mean?" "You're just going to," I stopped, unsure of what to even ask. None of this made sense. She reached for the door handle but paused, looking at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Don't stay here. Not even for a moment. Leave as soon as I'm out." "Wait," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You can't just leave me here." "What about the lights? The figures? What are they?" "They don't want me," she said simply. "But they'll want you if you linger." Before I could protest, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. The lanterns had stopped at the edge of the clearing, their glow reflecting off the puddles that dotted the ground. The figures holding them stood perfectly still, their faces turned toward me. The woman walked toward the chapel, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't look back, not even once. I wanted to call out to her, to demand answers, but fear rooted me in place. The figures began to move, their lanterns bobbing as they advanced toward the car. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning wildly in the mud before gaining traction. As I backed away, I saw the woman reach the chapel door. She pushed it open, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow her whole. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned the car around and sped back down the road, the rain blurring my vision and the trees closing in around me once more. The lanterns flickered in my rearview mirror, fading into the distance as I drove. When I finally reached the highway, the rain stopped abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The forest behind me was dark and still, as though nothing had ever happened. I never found out who the woman was or what she had led me into that night. But sometimes, when it rains, I catch a faint glimmer of light in the distance, like a lantern bobbing in the darkness, and I feel the weight of her warning. Don't stay. Not even for a moment. It was late September, and the rain had been coming down in unrelenting sheets for 2 straight days. I was driving back to Seattle after spending a weekend with friends in a remote cabin near Mount Rainier. The roads were slick, the visibility was terrible, and the wipers on my old Toyota barely kept up with the downpour. The drive should have been straightforward, but somewhere along the way, my GPS lost signal, and the directions became a confusing mess. I was on a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense forest, and every mile I drove felt like I was getting further from civilization. I checked the time, 10:43 p.m. It was late, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. My gas gauge hovered just above empty, and my nerves were starting to fray. The last town I'd passed was at least an hour behind me, and I hadn't seen another car on the road in what felt like forever. Just when I was starting to panic, my headlights caught the faint outline of a sign ahead. It was old and weathered, barely legible through the rain, but I could make out the words, Cedar Hollow, 3 miles. I breathed a sigh of relief. If there was a town nearby, I could stop for gas and directions, maybe even wait out the storm. As I turned onto the road leading to Cedar Hollow, a strange feeling settled over me. The trees seemed taller here, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. The rain, which had been deafening moments ago, seemed quieter, as though the forest itself was muffling the sound. I told myself I was being ridiculous, it was just a storm and a long drive playing tricks on my mind. The road narrowed even further, and the pavement gave way to gravel. My tires crunched over the stones, the sound oddly comforting in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of streetlights up ahead. The town came into view, its buildings huddled close together as if bracing against the storm. It was small, just a handful of old-fashioned storefronts, a diner, and a gas station with a single pump. I pulled into the gas station and parked under the awning, grateful for the brief reprieve from the rain. The place looked deserted. The lights were on, but the windows were dark, and there was no attendant in sight. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet asphalt and pine filling my nostrils. I tried the door to the gas station, but it was locked. Great, I muttered, turning back to my car. That's when I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the lot, barely visible in the rain. They were tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. For a moment, I thought they might be the attendant, but something about the way they stood, too still, too rigid, made me pause. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice wavering slightly. "Do you work here?" The figure didn't respond. They didn't move. The rain seemed to fall harder, drumming against the metal awning above me. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I decided to ignore them and focus on pumping gas, but when I turned back to my car, the figure was closer, standing just at the edge of the light. My heart raced as I fumbled with the gas pump. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their face. The nozzle slipped from my hands, and I cursed under my breath, glancing back toward the figure. They were gone. The lot was empty, the rain pounding against the asphalt. I scanned the area, my breath fogging in the cold air, but there was no sign of anyone. I told myself they must have gone into the diner or one of the nearby buildings, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I finished pumping the gas as quickly as I could and got back into the car, locking the doors behind me. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled out of the lot, eager to put the strange encounter behind me. As I drove through the empty streets of Cedar Hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every reflection in the rain-slicked pavement a reminder of the figure at the gas station. Just as I was about to turn onto the main road, my headlights caught movement up ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the street, blocking my path. It was the same person from the gas station, tall, thin, with that wide-brimmed hat obscuring their face. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, staring, or at least, I thought they were staring. It was impossible to tell. "Move!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure tilted their head, as if considering my words. Then, slowly, they raised one hand and pointed toward the forest. I followed their gesture, my eyes landing on the dark, tangled trees that bordered the town. When I looked back, the figure was gone. A wave of panic surged through me. I hit the gas, speeding past the spot where they'd been standing. The road wound through the forest, the trees pressing in on either side. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they pointed toward the woods? I didn't have long to wonder. Up ahead, something darted across the road, a flash of movement that sent my heart into my throat. I swerved to avoid it, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The car fishtailed, and I fought to regain control, finally coming to a stop on the side of the road. The forest was silent. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, coming from the trees. It wasn't an animal, it was too deep, too unnatural. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround the car. I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the darkness. That's when I saw them. Eyes, reflective, glowing faintly in the beam of my headlights. There were dozens of them, watching from the shadows. I didn't wait to find out what they belonged to. My foot slammed on the gas, and the car roared forward, tires kicking up water as I sped away. The rain seemed to fall harder, the forest closing in around me. In my rearview mirror, I saw the glowing eyes following, keeping pace with the car. The glowing eyes in the rearview mirror were multiplying. At first, there had been a handful, but now it seemed like dozens, or more. They bobbed and swayed in the darkness, some moving swiftly, others slower, as though they were watching and waiting for something. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The road ahead was a narrow ribbon of asphalt, flanked by dense forest. The rain blurred my windshield despite the wipers working at full speed. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I tried to stay focused. The eyes seemed to get closer every time I glanced in the mirror, their faint glow pulsing in the downpour. Suddenly, something darted across the road. It was fast, too fast for me to register what it was. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded, tires screeching against the slick road. The vehicle came to a jarring stop just inches from the tree line. I sat there, trembling, staring at the rain-slicked road. The glow of the headlights cut through the forest, illuminating nothing but tangled underbrush and gnarled trunks. The glowing eyes were gone, at least, for the moment. I tried to steady my breathing, my fingers fumbling to put the car back in drive. Then I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, like the sound of a single raindrop hitting glass, but it grew louder and more insistent. It was coming from the back of the car. Every instinct screamed at me not to look, but my body moved on its own. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see nothing. Instead, I saw a figure pressed against the back window, its face obscured by the shadows. The same figure I'd seen at the gas station and in the middle of the road. I yanked the gearshift into drive and floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires spinning against the wet pavement before gaining traction. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. The forest blurred past, the trees whipping by in a haze of rain and headlights. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, as though the figure was slamming its fists against the back window. I could feel the vibration reverberating through the car, each thud sending a jolt of terror down my spine. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence was almost worse. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. The back window was clear, nothing but the rain streaking down the glass. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself that I was safe now. That's when I saw the road ahead. The car was heading straight toward a narrow bridge, half flooded from the relentless rain. On the other side, the road seemed to disappear into darkness. My gut told me not to cross it, but there was no other choice. The glowing eyes were back, lurking at the edge of the forest behind me. They weren't following anymore, they were just watching. I pressed on, gripping the wheel tightly as the car splashed through the flooded bridge. The water was deeper than I'd expected, lapping against the sides of the vehicle. The headlights flickered briefly, plunging me into near darkness before sputtering back to life. As I reached the other side, the road opened into a clearing. The forest seemed to pull back, the trees thinning until they were nothing but shadows on the horizon. Relief washed over me as I saw the faint glow of a small building up ahead, a rest stop. I pulled into the gravel lot, parking under the weak glow of a flickering streetlight. The building was old and weathered, but the lights inside were on, and a faint hum of electricity buzzed through the air. I climbed out of the car, my legs shaky, and made my way toward the door. Inside, the rest stop was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the tiled floor. There was a vending machine in one corner, a payphone on the wall, and a row of empty benches. A single attendant sat behind the counter, an older man with a weathered face and a name tag that read, Frank. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "You have no idea," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him about the glowing eyes, the figure, and the knocking. As I spoke, his expression darkened. "You shouldn't have come this way," he said, shaking his head. "That stretch of road, people say it's cursed. Folks go missing out there all the time." "What do you mean?" I asked, my chest tightening. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's something in those woods. Been there long before the roads were built. People say it draws you in, makes you see things that aren't there. Makes you hear things." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Then why hasn't anyone closed it off?" He shrugged. "Town tried once. Didn't make a difference. Whatever it is, it doesn't stay put." A chill ran down my spine. I turned to look out the window, half expecting to see the glowing eyes staring back at me. But the lot was empty, my car sitting alone under the streetlight. "Best you head out while you can," Frank said, his tone somber. "And don't look back." I nodded, thanking him before heading back to my car. The rain had let up slightly, but the air was still heavy with moisture. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. As I pulled out of the lot and back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The forest loomed on either side, dark and endless. My headlights barely illuminated the road ahead, and every shadow seemed to shift and move. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the road, motionless and waiting. This time, there was no hat, no coat, just a pale, gaunt figure with glowing eyes that bore into me. I slammed on the brakes, but the car skidded on the wet pavement, veering off the road and into the ditch. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my chest heaving. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in silence. The rain started again, light at first, then heavier, pounding against the roof. And then, just above the sound of the rain, I heard it, the faint, deliberate tapping on the window. And I knew I wasn't alone. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.